obvious person to introduce the first lecture. And then Michael Gibbons from the Wharton School introduced the second. I'm not sure why I'm here to introduce the third lecture, but when David Ruderman tells you to do something, you do something. So here I am. Perhaps the reason is that I'm the only one who's connected to, I think, formally, to both the Wharton School and to the Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. Those are the sponsors for this talk. So let me begin with some thank yous. First to the Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, and particularly to David Ruderman. I'm on the academic board of directors for the Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. And so I had the privilege of working with David Ruderman, who, as anyone who knows him, can appreciate that he truly brings the vision, genius, intelligence to this center, and he's really transformed the center to, I would argue, the leading think tank on Jewish studies broadly defined, certainly in the United States and probably in the world. In the course of the many years, I've gotten the privilege of having many friends who have spent a year in the center, and I know how important that year is to them, not only in terms of forging their research careers and perhaps transforming their research careers, but also in terms of the friendships that they made and colleagues that they made from around the world, and its long-lasting collegial relationships that really extend beyond the year, perhaps in some cases even for a lifetime. So the center really deserves a tremendous debt of gratitude, certainly to the people who sponsor the center and so on. So that's a side job for me. My real job is that I'm a faculty member at the Wharton School. I've been here, this is my, hopefully I don't look that old, this is my 35th year on the faculty of the Wharton School.
What's your name?
So my name, I thought I started by giving my name, I did. My name is Albert Krieger, I didn't think it was important, but that's my name. Thank you, my name is Albert Krieger. I've been in the faculty of the Wharton School for 35 years, and certainly when Mike Gibbons, who's the deputy dean, was asked to co-sponsor this year, since it has a business component to it, we owe Mike, a close friend, a tremendous debt of gratitude, because not only did he agree to, but he really agreed to with open arms, with open pockets, and with tremendous enthusiasm. So, now to the topic at hand. I want to introduce today's speaker, Professor Adam Keller. As you'll be able to see fairly quickly, Adam earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from Oxford University, so that'll be fairly clear. Hebrew literature and Jewish studies. He then went to Hebrew University, where he earned again another master's degree and a PhD in modern Jewish history, both with the highest distinction. He's published many, many articles, even though he's much younger than I. And he's written books. Basically, probably most commonly in the area of social and economic history, particularly in the early modern history in Eastern Europe. He is the co-editor of the Journal of Jewish Studies. He's also on the team that's helping design. There's going to be a new Jewish museum in Poland, in Warsaw, and he's on the committee that's helping design. It's due to open, I don't know if they're on schedule, in 2010. That's why I said I didn't think. But that's at least the... So anyway, you're not here to hear me. Now you know who I am. And so let me introduce again Professor Adam Keller, who will be speaking on before Rothschild, Jewish businessmen in 18th century Eastern Europe.
Very much. I also want to thank you for braving the elements and coming out on a very cold and snowy day to hear me talk about things that happened a long time ago and a long way away.
Adam, is the mic on?
I think it's on. Yeah. There's a green light.
That's the...
Better?
Okay.
I'm very excited to be lecturing here at the Wharton Business School. I've dealt with Jewish history, Jewish economic history, as long as I've been in Jewish studies. This is the first time I've come to a business school to speak. I've got a feeling rather like the first time I gave a lecture at the Hebrew University overlooking the Temple Mount I don't quite know what that says about my values, but I have the same feeling. So I think I'll start. The French engineer Jean-Claude Pargeron was employed in the fortress of Zamość in central Poland between 1760 and 1763. And in a letter home, which he wrote on the 19th of September 1763, he described the following Jewish ceremony. Celebrations were being held at the residence of Prince Czartoryski in Zamość. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a large crowd of Jews appeared in front of the palace gates, headed by a Jewish man on horseback carrying a large doll. Another Jew, dressed like a Turk and with a sword in his hand, and 6 more Jews accompanied by music and bearing a cake. The man, acting as representative of the Jews, carried a silver basin and drinking vessels, while 5 other Jews carried silver bowls filled with sugar, coffee, and lemons. This entourage was accompanied by numerous Jewish men and women. On reaching the center of the palace courtyard, the first Jew dismounted from his horse and began to dance with his doll, performing incredible leaps and bounds in time to the Jewish music. Following this, the Turk performed a solo dance and a dance with his friend. After a short while, a spokesman stepped forward and began to deliver a speech in Hebrew, Discours Hébreu, excuse my French accent, to which the crowd of Jews responded with great cries and much applause, followed by a song. Once they had finished singing, they performed the Jewish dances, Polish Cossack dances, and Mayufis. Later on, they went into the palace to hand over the gifts. This was accompanied by a second speech in Polish, Latin, and German, presumably Yiddish. After the gifts had been handed over, they retired. So first of all, what is this ceremony? What's going on? Well, actually a lot of ink has been spilt over this question, but as I understand it, the doll carried by the Jew on horseback is a Torah scroll. The Turkish dress worn by the other Jew is a kaftan or kapota. The Mayufis song that was sung at the end is a common Hebrew Sabbath hymn, in modern Hebrew it's called Mayafit, and in certain Orthodox prayer books you can find it until today. The Mayafit was the song which Jews sang to welcome their noble Lord when he came to visit or when they went to visit him. Interestingly, in the 19th and 20th centuries, this song, the Mayafit or Mayufis, was attacked bitterly as a form of Jewish sycophancy. This was the time when the Jewish relationship with the nobility had come under strong attack. But in fact, the song and the ceremony were not a form of sycophancy in the sense that 19th and 20th century nationalist Jews wanted to believe, but were rather an act of homage, a feudal act, in which a subject greeted or welcomed his feudal lord on a special occasion. The Jews came in full panoply with a rabbi or a communal leader carrying a Sefer Torah. They came with gifts which they brought from afar, lemons, spices, sugar. These were expensive things which were given to the Lord as a form of homage. Of course, this kind of ceremony was not a Jewish ceremony. All feudal subjects gave such ceremonies when they met their lord. In the cases of peasants, it might just be bread and salt that were given, but something was given. The homage was given because the feudal lord was the lord and the rest were his subjects. So what does this ceremony tell us? What can we learn from it? What I see here is a sign that the Jews were deeply integrated into the society where they lived. Like every other group, they paid feudal homage to their lord. They were an accepted part. He took their gifts, just as he took the gifts of everyone else on his estate. Why? Why would the feudal lord accept Jewish gifts like he would accept gifts from Christian townspeople or peasants or other groups? Certainly not on the basis of love of the Jews, nor on the basis of any kind of ideology of toleration, but because of pure business interests. Between the nobleman and his Jews, there was a commonality of economic interest. which meant that the nobleman wanted the Jews as an integral part of his estates, and the Jews were happy to give him the feudal homage which he deserved in order to play that role. It is this economic interest, it is this commonality of business in which I'm interested here today. I'm going to try and look at the nobleman as a businessman and the Jewish society as made up of businessmen and show how the two interact. I want to show how the economic rationale of 18th century Eastern Europe brought the Polish nobility and the Jews into this close business relationship and what it meant for both sides. I'm going to base my work largely on research I did in the archives of Eastern Europe, particularly in Warsaw, on the archives of a very important major Polish noble family, the Radziwiłł family. But I will also be using work written by scholars who preceded me in this field, in particular Yakov Goldberg of the Hebrew University, Moshe Rossman of Bar-Ilan University, Gershon Hundert from McGill University in Canada, and Adam Kazimierczyk, who teaches Jewish history in the Jagiellonian University of Prague. Once I've looked at this story, once we've understood the meaning of this business relationship, I should try to bring things a little closer to hand by asking what this story can tell us about the way modern society has understood this relationship. No, I can tell how this story can help us understand how we see the relationship between Jewish businessmen, Jewish economic activity, and the rise of capitalism. So, as often in these things, I have to start with a little background, and I hope you'll excuse me, but as I said, Poland, Lithuania is a long way away, and we're talking about a long time ago. So I have to give a little background. I hope you'll bear with me. In the early modern period, just from the 15th to the 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a huge country in East Central Europe. It was established by the Union of Lublin in 1569, and it covered most of what we would today call Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. A vast, huge country. It stretched from the shores of the Baltic in the north, almost to the Black Sea in the south. And from Silesia in the west up to the borders of Russia, eastern Belarus, in the east. The country in this period began as a constitutional monarchy. They called it a noble democracy. There was a king, but the king was elected by the nobility. We normally think of royalty as the king is dead, long live the king. A son inherits the crown from his father. Not so in Poland. When the king died, all the nobility gathered together, they held elections, and a new king was elected. Hard for us to understand. There's a balance of power between the king, who was still a figure of great authority, and the Sejm, the noble parliament, where the representatives of the nobility met to decide on the laws. By the period we're talking about, this balance of power had swung. The king had got progressively weaker, and the nobility, particularly the higher, the upper stratum of the nobility, called the magnates, had got particularly strong. These magnates were members of about 20 families. They owned vast estates scattered across Poland and Lithuania, huge places with dozens of towns, tens of thousands of inhabitants, if not more. Huge estates from which they made their money. They sat in the upper house of the parliament, called the Senate, and they were a powerful group. Each estate was more or less like a small kingdom within Poland, a state within a state. Their power over their estates was unlimited. Like most of Europe in this period, Poland had a highly agricultural economy. Most of the population were peasants. They worked the land. They grew grain. Poland, in particular, the Ukrainian part of this country, was blessed with enormously fertile soil. In the 16th and 17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been known as the bread basket of Europe. It exported huge amounts of grain to Central Europe, which was then embroiled in wars and didn't have enough food to feed itself. It got extremely rich from doing so. And in the process, its economy changed. The feudal system, which was dying out in part in Central and Western Europe, became stronger in Poland. It was the best and most efficient way to get land worked. So instead of changing feudal dues to money rents and moving in the direction of capitalism, as happened elsewhere, in Poland, the peasants became tied to the land. They had to work the land in order to receive their rights as subjects of their noble lord. It was a highly effective system. As I said, huge amounts of grain were grown. The exports, particularly up the rivers to the north of Poland to the Baltic Sea, flourished, and Poland became the wealthiest and strongest country in Central and Eastern Europe. What about the Jews? Well, the Jews had come to Poland, even before this, in the Middle Ages, as part of an effort to strengthen the market for grain. Okay? They'd lived in Germany, a region called, by the Jews, Ashkenaz, and that's why the Polish Jews are known as Ashkenazi Jews. And as the Jews were brought from there to settle Poland, to settle the towns of Poland, they came with a huge wave of migration, including non-Jews. Also, they settled the towns. They were brought in to run the markets. This is part of this same effort to create markets for grain, to get the economy moving. They soon became a second urban group, sort of living in parallel to the non-Jewish townspeople. Okay? If the town had a town council, the Jewish community had a community council. If the town had urban courts, then the Jewish community had its own rabbinic courts. These are two separate groups running the towns together. However, in economic terms, the Jews were outsiders. The town was a monopoly. Anyone who did business in the town had to belong to the urban guilds as part of the urban monopoly, and the Jews were excluded. They had to break the monopoly. It made everyone else very irritated. But it was the only way they could make it. In fact, this exclusion of the Jews from the monopolistic forms of pre-modern economy and their attempts to break the monopoly have led certain economic thinkers, particularly a German thinker from the beginning of the 20th century, Werner Sombart, who I'm sure Professor Karp mentioned in his lecture 2 weeks ago, to argue that in fact it was this aspect of Jewish economic life, of Jewish culture, Sombart even hinted this was part of the Jewish racial makeup, that would make the Jews the bearers of capitalism to Europe. Their breaking of the urban monopolies were, in his formulation, the first step towards capitalism, and this was a truly Jewish phenomenon. And he had the figures and the data, at least a priori, to back up his argument. Well, I'm going to try and show a bit later on that this wasn't quite the case in Eastern Europe, and when I get back to it, I'll mention Sombart again. But the Jews weren't the only people in Eastern Europe interested in breaking the urban monopoly. There was another group. The nobility, on their estates, who were producing grain, wanted to sell their grain on the urban markets. And if the urban market was a monopoly, then the terms of trade for them were no good. So they wanted to break the monopoly. And early on, the nobility discovered that they weren't the only group wanting to break the monopoly, and so did the Jews. And an economic connection was made between the two groups in their hostility towards the non-Jewish townspeople and the urban monopolies. As time went on, this noble Jewish connection grew a little stronger. When Poland-Lithuania was finally created in 1569, as a result of all kinds of political manipulations, huge parts of eastern Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine, were given over to the nobility and created huge latifundium, they called huge estates, which nobility needed to manage. They needed to use this estate to create wealth. Why does a nobleman want an estate? An estate is to create the basis of his wealth, and from his wealth will stem his political power. So he needs to run these estates. He needs to make these estates profitable. But he himself is not interested in travelling far to the east, moving away from the centre of political power. He wants to be where the king is. He wants to be in the centre. He wants to rule. So how to make money? He leases his estate. He gives the estate in return for a cash payment. He needs a businessman who will come, put money on the table to the nobleman, and then in return will take the estate and run it for himself. Now the Jews who had been moneylenders in a previous life saw in estate leasing a way of making a great deal more money. You didn't just lend money on a pawn. Yeah? You lend money on a pawn, the guy comes, he redeems the pawn, you make a small profit. Here, by leasing an estate, the Jewish moneylender had a chance to make the estate more profitable and to increase his profit margins. This was a great thing for the Jewish businessmen of Eastern Europe. For the noblemen it was a wonderful thing too, because they didn't have to worry about running their estates. They had a Jewish man or a consortium of Jewish businessmen who would do it for them. This means that the Jewish moneylenders stop being Jewish moneylenders and move into the field of agricultural management. For the first time since the fall of the Second Temple, we see the Jews working in the agricultural economy. Major, major change. For the Jews it's a great thing too, because once they lease the estate and the nobleman is away in Warsaw, they're sitting in place in the nobleman's house or small palace, running the estate just as if they were noblemen. So they've taken this economic change and turned it into new social status. De facto, not de jure, not in law. In law, the Jews remain Jews and no one remained no one. But in reality, the guy in charge was Jewish. And if a peasant or a townsperson or someone else had a problem, he had to come and negotiate with the Jewish businessman who was running the estate. Wonderful system. Jews loved it. Those who were in power loved it. But like all these systems, it had a problem. It had a whole range of problems. First of all, the peasants in Ukraine resented being exploited to make money, both for the Jews and for the noblemen. The noblemen were Polish, and they were either Ukrainians, Belarusian, or some other nationality. Yes. Most of them were Russian Orthodox. The nobility were Catholic, and the Jews, Jewish. They felt like they were being Catholicized. In fact, that was a process that went on. A process of Polonization and Catholicization. Long words. But worst of all, the natural order of society in which Christians run things and Jews are humiliated have been reversed. And this was like a powder keg. And in 1648, a huge peasant rebellion breaks out. It's a very complicated story, and another one I'm not going to go into. Suffice it to say that within a very short time it gets out of control. At exactly that moment, the Polish king decides to die. So all the nobility who should be fighting the war to put down the peasant have to go off to Warsaw to elect a new king. And so this turns into a massive disaster for Poland. And within a few years, its neighbours, Sweden to the north, it's hard for us to understand, but in the 16th, 17th century, Sweden was a major political player in Europe. Russia to the east decides they're also going to invade. Why not? Poland's in disarray. And so Poland is plunged into 20 years of war. Disastrous war. Okay, that's the introduction. What interests us here today is what happened after the war. So the first thing that you do after a war, 20 years war, it's not a joke. Okay? You've got Ukrainians, you've got Tatars, you've got Swedes, you've got Russians, anyone having a the levels of destruction were tremendous. Up to 90% of the crop yield was down, was destroyed. Yield dropped by up to 90%. That's much better. In the towns, huge percentage of the houses are destroyed. The shops are no longer functioning. The economy is in total disarray. Worse than that, the export market for grain from Poland collapsed totally. There were two reasons. Poland left the market open. I mean, if if you're not active in the market, it changes, and that's what happened. But worse than the Poles, the rest of Europe, Central and Western Europe, began to reconstruct itself after their wars started in 1648. They didn't need Polish grain anymore. Which meant that when Poland actually began to reconstruct itself, there was a big question, what are we going to do with all the grain? And we knew what to do with it before, but what are we going to do with it now? How are we going to make an economy for this country in these new conditions? There was really only one group in Poland with the resources to take on this process of reconstruction. The towns were weak and been terribly destroyed. The lower nobility had lost their possessions. It was only that small, narrow stratum of magnates who had these huge estates who were able to think about reconstructing the economy. If you have one town with a few people and some fields around it, and you lose 90% of that, you have nothing. If you have 100 towns, thousands of fields, dozens of villages, and you lose 90% of that, you're left with something to start from. So it was the magnates who took on the project of reconstructing the Polish economy following these wars. It worked in a number of different ways. First of all, they began to swallow up all the other small estates. The lower nobility, many of them had their own little estates round and about, lost their estates. They were sort of swallowed up by these huge latifundium, these huge noble estates, and these minor nobility took on the role of estate administrators in the service of the great magnates. As a result, the Jews who had done this before had to go. Okay? Jews knew better than to go into any kind of competition with non-Jewish noblemen. That's suicide. So all the Jewish administrators sort of quietly left these jobs and let the Polish nobility take them on. So where could these magnates sort of build the reconstruction from? What was the basis they had? It was their estates. They needed to reorganize that economy to make it profitable again. They needed the income. Okay? This is another form of business thinking that I don't think is very strange to us today, where the social and political economic elite believe that the only way to save the situation is by making themselves richer. We know this idea. So this is what happened in Poland. Okay? The magnates believed that by enriching themselves, by making their estates more profitable, the country would do better. And they viewed the estate quite clearly as a form of business, sort of a landed business, right? As a huge agricultural corporation. And they needed to extract more from the home market. There was no export of grain. The grain had to be sold at home. So they started a project, a process. First of all, attract many more people to work the land. Peasants have gone, they've been killed, they've fled. We need more hands tilling the soil. Number one. Number two, we need to sell the grain. That grain has to be turned into money. Okay? It's quite not a very sophisticated form of economic thinking, but effective, at least in the 18th century. How can we do that? Well, state owners had a number of means of doing this. First of all, they held monopolies. They held a monopoly over trade that was done in their estate. They held a monopoly over milling grain into flour. And they held a monopoly over the manufacture and sale of alcohol. And it was from these monopolies that they decided they were going to make their money. Every sale that was made in a town had to pay a customs to the lord. Okay? It doesn't matter if it was grain or something else. Right? The more business that was done on the estate, the more income the lord would have, the magnate would have. So he was interested in encouraging trade as much as possible. The more people there were milling corn, milling the grain to make flour for bread, the more he would make. Okay? 1/3 of every amount of grain that was milled went back to the lord for him to use or to sell. And most importantly, as we will discover in a moment, if a peasant or anyone else wanted a drink of beer, he could only drink it in a pub owned by his lord, and it's owned by the estate owner. In some places, how much he had to drink was also part of the deal. If you didn't drink your litre or 2 litres of vodka a week, you hadn't done your feudal duties to the lord. It wasn't a problem for the Polish peasants. It's not a nice life being a peasant. You're a long way away from anywhere. No television, they hadn't invented it. And no cinema, they invented that either. There were newspapers, but the peasants didn't know how to read. So the only thing you have to do in the evening is to go and drink in order to forget that tomorrow is going to be just the same as today. So this process starts with a massive wave of investment in infrastructure. Small towns were rebuilt, and new ones were built. This kind of network of small towns spreads out across eastern Poland. New mills are built, and new taverns are built. I got a few figures. I won't bore you too much with these figures, but in the Belarusian town of Kopish in 1684, there are 7 mills, 3 taverns, and 80 years later, there are 14 mills and 39 taverns. And in the Lithuanian town of Nevel in 1712, you have 6 mills, 6 taverns. In 1764, you've gone up to 7 mills and 48 taverns. Right? Which is a sign of just how important the manufacture and sale of alcohol were in this process of reconstruction. Okay? In this exploitation of the home market in order to enrich the magnate landowner. Okay, so you've invested in infrastructure, that's the first stage. The next stage is to get people in, managing it and running it for you. Well, who to choose? The minor nobility, whom the magnates had put into various posts in return for their taking over their estate, they were not good businessmen. Right? Noblemen were not known for their business acumen. They were known for getting drunk, raising hell, and generally being obnoxious. But if you wanted to make money, this was not a good choice. The townspeople, the non-Jewish townspeople, were old enemies. Okay? And really, what the estate owners wanted to do with them was to draw them back to work the land. Right? These small agricultural towns were places where many of the townspeople were little better than peasants. The estate owner needed the hands to work the soil, and he could put pressure on the non-Jewish townspeople to do it. Who was he left with? He left with his old business allies. Okay? The Jewish businessmen he'd already worked with before the wars were the natural people to bring in to this new system. So what I've tried to show you here is a whole new business management of landed estates, aimed at exploiting the home market, okay, by bringing as many people as possible to work the land, bringing in Jewish businessmen, right, to manage the estates, right, and to bring more cash income to the noblemen. So the next question we need to ask is, what about the Jews? It's all very well the noblemen wanting the Jews. What did the Jews think about it? Well, the Jews, and in particular the business elite, were interested in moving away from the previous system, which had brought them into conflict with all the people in Poland. When they'd managed the estates, it had irritated the peasants. When they'd broken the urban monopoly, it had irritated the townspeople. Now, when they were doing business, estate administration, it irritated the minor nobility. They needed to change the status quo. In short, they were interested in creating a new economic reality for themselves. So the magnates' plans were extremely attractive. Once again, there are two groups who were interested in economic change. And so the Jews go with the magnates. In order to do this, the Jews needed a new business plan. Okay, one that dovetailed with the estate owner's needs. And they developed a 3-point program. Now, this is not a kind of, no one sat down and wrote out a business program. But you can see across the Commonwealth that these 3 steps I'm going to talk about happened in many, many places. And it's clear that Jewish society en masse had understood this. First of all, settlement. the Jews negotiated with the estate owners new privileges for settlement. Each community had its own privilege, a document. Jews may live in this town, they may trade, they may do crafts, they may do this, they may do that. Particularly, they may sell alcohol. This meant that many Jews came and settled in these small towns in Eastern Europe. Until these towns had 50%, 60%, 70% Jewish population. Why? Because the magnate, nobleman, wanted the Jews there to do his economic services. Does anyone know how we call small towns in Yiddish? Shtetl. Okay, this is the period where the Jewish shtetl of Eastern Europe comes into being. And it comes into being because it serves the economic interest of the Polish noblemen, and for no other reason than that. Okay, that's number one. We have the Jews settling new towns across Europe. Number two, a new kind of lease. Okay? Jews couldn't lease entire estates anymore. They had noblemen in the way, and it irritated the peasants. So instead of leasing an entire estate and becoming like a nobleman, they leased all the monopoly rights on the estate. So a bundle of rights were leased, not the whole estate. It meant that all the sale of alcohol, all the milling of grain, and all the grain, and all the collection of taxes and customs were in the hands of the Jewish leaseholders. Okay? A small business elite, probably 1,000 to 2,000 Jews, no more, out of a population of hundreds of thousands. This was great. Okay? The business contact with the magnates was retained, but all the social aspects of the Jew being an estate owner and having control over the peasants, and that had gone. The Jews were simply in business. They were running the business. Okay? This was the cash cow. This was where the income was coming from, and the Jews were sitting, saying Hebrew, ala shalter. They had control of the faucet where the money was coming from. The other thing the Jews needed was protection. Okay? Business is business. Right? Things get ugly. The Jews needed someone to back them up. They couldn't make the system work without protection. So part of the deal with the magnates, with the noblemen, was if we get into business trouble, you come and back us up. Of course, the Jews knew if the noblemen backed them up, there was no one to touch them. And that was the case. By the way, this included the use of soldiers to collect debts. Right? Each magnate owner had his own private army. So if somebody ran up a debt with the Jewish tavern keeper, or didn't pay his taxes, right, the Jewish leaseholder, Polish arendacz, could call on soldiers to come and deal with the recalcitrant debtor. This included the priests. Okay? In these towns, priests very often felt they had the right to ignore these monopolies. They were, after all, representatives of the church. If they wanted to brew liquor at home, well, why shouldn't they? Well, if the Jewish lessee found out that the priest was brewing liquor at home, he went and told the magnate, who sent his soldiers and broke the still. In one case, a Jewish leaseholder by the name of Gedalia Itzkovich wrote to Rajab, who was his lord, requesting to remove the priest. He said, this priest is constantly breaking the monopoly in my town. I want you to get him removed. Okay? So once again, we can see that these Jewish leaseholders are not only serving the magnate, they're not only doing business with and for the magnate, they're turning this business into social spectacles. They're the representatives of the Lord on the ground. They may just be running the tavern, but everybody in the village or the town knows who the tavern belongs to and where the money's going. Right? Nobody likes to pay taxes, and everyone hates the tax collector. Okay? That wasn't any different in the 18th century than it is today. But the tax collector represented the magnate. And if you did something against him, right, you were hurting the magnate's interest, and you had trouble. The Jews bankrolled the magnates. So if the magnate wanted to make a payment to somebody, some tradesman, some merchant, or somebody he employed, okay, he wouldn't have money on hand. He'd write out a check, well, a kind of check, called asignacja in Polish. It says, I owe you 5,000 zlotys, go to my arendacz, go to my leaseholder, Moshko, in the town or wherever, and he'll give you the money. Okay? So that outside the houses of these Jewish leaseholders, there will be a queue of important people in the estate coming to get their money. Right. So this is a relationship that is good for everyone. The Jews fan out across the Polish countryside. The vast majority live in small market towns, and the urban markets is trying to make them work. It's very interesting though. Once the Jews are running the show, and they're not trying to break in like they were in the previous day, actually the town belongs to them more or less. They work in a monopolistic way. We have regulations from the towns of Zaslav and the town of Brody, setting up urban monopolies. Okay? You can only do trade in these towns if you belong to the Jewish trading guilds. The Jewish trading guilds set the prices and they set the terms of trade. Right? There is no breaking of the monopoly in this situation because the whole economy is one big monopoly. Okay? Many Jews move out into the villages. About a third of the Jews live in the villages. Okay? This is an enormously successful business. Okay? The proportion of the income which the magnate makes from his estate goes up to nearly 40%. Okay? 40% of the income comes from these leases. This gives the Jews enormous economic clout. Okay? But the magnates become richer and more powerful. Some of the Jews sort of go along behind them, their fellow travellers getting richer behind them. Okay? It's worth remembering, individual Jews could still suffer. Okay? It was a group security. If a priest wanted to harm a single Jew, he could find a way to do it. But as a group, the Jews' status rose astonishingly in this situation. This could lead to a certain amount of tension between estate owners and the Jews. The estate owners wanted to put up the prices of the leases all the time as part of making more and more money. And the Jews, of course, wanted to keep the leases down as low as possible. Okay, there is a Jewish law, the custom Jewish law called chazakah, kind of Jewish monopoly, which forbids competition over this kind of economic activity in certain circumstances. And the Jews tried to use it, deploy it in order to keep competition to a minimum. And when the nobleman found out about it, he punished the Jews. I have one case of a poor Jewish businessman who had claimed chazakah over his leasehold, and he was whipped 50 times in each of the corners of the town. I think it was shovel in the 1750s, because he tried to keep competition down. Contracts were for 3 years. But if the businessman didn't offer an increase in the price every year, he would lose the deal. There'd be someone else waiting to offer more. I have one wonderful case of a leasehold from a town called Kamieniec in Lithuania, from June the 5th, 1750. In the morning, two leaseholders, one called Abraham, one called Pinchas, came and offered Radziwill 15,666 zlotys for a 3-year lease on this estate, and he signed the deal. Must have been about lunchtime. A Jew called Baruch ben Shlomo turned up and offered Radziwill 18,154 zlotys for the same lease, which he'd signed for a 3-year term in the morning. So Radziwill signed with him at lunchtime. In the evening, Abraham and Pinchas heard that Baruch ben Shlomo had been there, came back and offered 19,000. So Radziwill signed with them for 19,000. Okay? 4,000 zlotys, one day's business. It's not a bad deal. What it tells us is, this is a profitable business. Okay, these Jewish businessmen are not going to run this as a loss. This is not the profit. So if there's 4,000 zlotys to be signed away in one day, that means there's a lot more profit in the system. Okay, so throughout the 18th century, both the estate owners and the Jews benefited from this business relationship. And that's the reason why the custom that we saw, I mentioned at the beginning, was so important. It was important to both sides. This was a feudal relationship, and it's a business deal within a feudal context. And it was important for both sides that that context was preserved. Because it was in the context of that feudal system that the Jewish businessmen made their money. They couldn't have worked in another way, in another system. It was not without its problems, however. Okay? Economically speaking, this overemphasis on exploiting the home market meant that economic development aimed at export and improving the balance of payments, the country's balance of payments, was sidelined. No one thought about it. The economy as a whole was geared to benefit just a small economic and political elite and its fellow travellers. but this was to the detriment of society as a whole. Moreover, some of the policies, particularly encouraging the peasants to drink more and more alcohol, okay, had very negative side effects, extremely problematic. Okay? By the end of the century, when reforms aimed at modernising the economy come into being, there was a general agreement that this system of monopoly leases was highly destructive, not least because there was a great problem of alcoholism in the Polish villages. Changing the system, however, couldn't be done unless the magnates agreed. And the magnates were the leading force in the country, and they weren't going to agree. So instead of general economic discussions, economic plans, the anger and the hostility was focused on one group. You know what I'm talking about, the Jews. It was much easier to attack Jewish economic activity as the reason for the country's economic woes than it was to talk about macroeconomics, the magnate system, the leasing, and so on. So when we came to the later part of the 18th century, there were decisions to expel the Jews from the villages, to stop Jewish leasing taverns, weakening their hold over the urban markets. And these became quite common topics of discussion, even in the great four-year reforming save in Poland from 1788 to 1792. This was the period in which the great catchphrase, which I imagine Professor Karp also mentioned, productivization came into being. The Jews were held to be non-productive, but they only sold things. Okay? They were supposed to become productive and make them. How this was supposed to be done, where it was supposed to be done, who was going to let the Jews do it, no one talked about that. But the Jews should be productive. That was another catchphrase that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries. But with magnate support, nothing. Little could be done for many, many decades. It's worth noting that in this economic reality, the development of capitalism, the breakdown of the feudal economy, its replacement with modern forms of impersonal economy were extremely threatening to the Jews. They didn't want it very much. I mean, there were Jewish businessmen who understood what it meant and went down the road towards. There's no capitalism, but they went down the road towards it. But for most of the Jewish businessmen, this was not such a great idea. The system where they were cooperating with the magnates was a much better idea. So what's interesting here is the fact that enormous Jewish economic success, okay, that we can see here, okay, was a success which they succeeded in translating into social security. They couldn't actually be touched very much. Not to say social status and even a measure of power in society with the support of the magnates. What I'd like to argue is the causes of this success were not inherent. There was nothing Jewish about what happened. There was nothing Jewish about these businessmen that made them better businessmen or made this system work. It was conjunctural. It was the fact that there were two groups with similar economic desires that came together and could cooperate and achieve their goals. I would run a risk of doing what historians shouldn't do, and say that in a different social and political constellation, it's not difficult to see the non-Jewish townspeople doing pretty much what the Jewish townspeople did, the Jewish businessmen did, and doing it with not much less success. Now, I'm not allowed to do that. I'm only allowed to say what actually happened. So what I think might have happened, that's a no-no. But I did it anyway. It was the Jewish businessmen. They were the right people at the right time. They needed to invest in changing the socio-economic status quo. They were wise enough to identify the powerful group of the magnates in Polish-Lithuanian society interested in the same thing, and they were flexible enough to adapt themselves to this new reality and to make it work. But note, this was not a capitalist or even a pre-capitalist situation. It was a form of feudalism. The Jews of Eastern Europe entered and embraced the monopolistic reality of the 18th century, both encouraging its development, and so the empowerment of the magnates, or further empowerment of the magnates, and benefiting from it hugely themselves. This, of course, was a time where Jewish businessmen in other places, most most notably the Rothschilds, who I mentioned in my title, were taking the early steps towards the development of what we would recognize as a modern capitalist economy. So really, to my way of thinking, there is no Jewish affinity to one economic system or another. Just a combination of conjunctural factors which will allow different Jewish groups to do better or worse in different economic environments. So finally, I would finish, I promise I'll finish. We might ask, were these 18th century Jewish businessmen deluded in the economic choices they made? Their embrace of the feudal economy brought them wealth and even social status in the short term, but ultimately trapped them in a decaying economic system threatened by the modern forms of the capitalist economy. Was this a failure of foresight? Were there Western European co-religionists better adjusted and more capable of economic success because they embraced the capitalist ethos? Looking around me at the incipient meltdown of the American and the world economy, I'm no longer sure that this was the case. Thank you very much. Okay, that's your turn.
You say there was nothing specifically Jewish about that result, but wouldn't it have been the factor of Jewish literacy versus non-Jewish illiteracy that made that happen?
Jews were a literate group, they were also a numerate group. The question is, how much more literate and numerate were they than other groups in society? More than the peasants, undoubtedly. The peasants didn't know it. More than the townspeople, probably, but how much more, that's a question. I vacillate between thinking that Jews are more literate as a cause and not, and sometimes I say one, sometimes I say the other, because I don't really have an answer. But bottom line, I reckon that in an economic environment, other groups would get up to speed in order to do it if they needed to. I think the economy would drive other groups to achieve things that the Jews achieved.
Even in the presence of a church which might not want literacy?
Well, in Poland and Lithuania, surprisingly enough, the church was not a very strong social and certainly not a strong economic force. The church fulminates and argues and shouts about what people should be doing and what should be done to the Jews, but people go on doing what they're doing. I mean, they're very devout, but there's kind of a gap between theology and economic practice. Right, okay. Yeah.
I'm talking about a strata of Jews in these towns.
Yeah.
But were these the masses of Jews that were around, or a select group within the Jewish
Okay, well,
community?
what happened was something like this. I ought to have mentioned it, I may have skipped over that section of the thing, which was probably a good thing that I thought it too long. Once these Jewish businessmen had taken over these leases, okay, so all the monopoly rights in a certain estate, they broke it down, okay, and they leased it out sort of place by place. So the big Jewish businessman would lease the whole estate with 50 taverns, 20 mills, 6 towns, and then they would separate it out and make subleases, and even sub-subleases. So they could, in fact, introduce a whole strata of Jewish society into it. So it's a kind of a Jewish patronage system. In addition, there were Jewish masses. The Jewish population grew and settled in these small towns, and it caused all kinds of problems. But this system enabled that to happen. When you talk about the Jewish demographic revolution in this period, Jews grow exponentially starting in the 18th century. And it's based on their ability, the conditions in which they live. Yeah.
In the revolt of 1648, I would have thought that the Jews would have been the first target and would have been so decimated that there weren't that many to take over once the revolt was over. I mean, how did they fare in that revolt?
The Jews, I think they were the second target after the Poles, but they did very badly. A third of the Jewish population of Ukraine seems to have been killed, and more would have left, and in the aftermath of war, it's terrible. What's remarkable, quite astonishing, when you look back, not just over 1648, but there's a whole 20 years of war, is how quickly and how effectively Jewish society managed to reconstruct itself. Okay? But the losses were enormous. I mean, every third Jewish person in Ukraine seems to have died. But one of the things I was trying to argue here is it's because of their economic capabilities, their understanding of the need to join forces with the forces of Reconstruction, and that economic relationship they developed, which enabled the Jews to overcome this terrible setback. Even during the war itself, the Jews who were suffering in Ukraine never lost sight of the fact that it was the Poles who were their allies. There's a famous story in the fortress of a town in Ukraine called Tulchin. There's a Polish nobleman who owned the town had in fact agreed to hand the Jews over to the Cossacks to be massacred. And the Jews were sitting around discussing what they were going to do. And there was a radical group there who wanted to get hold of the nobleman and kill him. I mean, take revenge on him. And the rabbi and other people in that group, this is according to one of the chronicles, said, no, if we kill a Polish nobleman, it will go across Poland, and our relationship with the nobility will be irreparably damaged. We're not going to do that. And they didn't. And they were massacred. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there was any effort to diversify with a lot of the wealth that they were creating for the Jewish managers. Because they must have felt that there was some risk in being so dependent.
No, in that sense, no, I don't think that kind of diversification, no, there wouldn't. Very closed market. I mean, there is trading, people travel abroad to trade, but in terms of what you're thinking of creating new forms of economic activity, no, I don't think that happens. Quite the reverse. I honestly think that everyone sees this as a highly beneficial relationship, one that's worth continuing. And they don't see the risks in it. And they might even have been right. And that's what I was trying to say at the end.
Yeah, it's one of the titles is Myth and Reality. What are some of the various myths?
What some of the myths?
Yeah.
Well, until very recently, the relationship between the Jews and the nobles was characterized as one of exploitation, whereby the noblemen were viciously anti-Semitic, did anything to harm the Jews, impoverished them, imprisoned them, tried to convert them. This was one of the great periods of decline and decay of Jewish society in the world, which in that old argument led to the birth of Hasidism, as a kind of Jewish spiritual response to that oppression. It's only the last generation of research that we begin to understand that that really wasn't the case, that this is a myth. The Jews of Eastern Europe were not economically backward in the 18th century. They were economically forward. They grasped the possibilities of this new economic system and were using it. And that allows us to go back and look at the nexus between Jews and capitalism in a new light. To say that the Jews embracing capitalism in another time and another place was not qualitatively different from their embracing the feudal economy here. It's not a special affinity. It's just the conditions are right for this here, and they're right for that there. And that each system has within it benefits, drawbacks, and possibly at the end, disaster and meltdown. It happened to the Jews of Eastern Europe, and maybe it's happening today.
To what extent were Jews involved in other trades at this time?
Jews were very involved in trade. Okay? They were brought into these small towns, into these shtetl, to run the markets. That's what they did. In many of these towns, there are no other merchants but Jews. Okay? In some places, in one town I found, somewhere in the north, I forget which one, some priest or another was mooting the idea of kicking the Jews out of town. And there was some old law that said Jews couldn't live here, and then the townspeople wrote a nice note to the magnate. They said, "Dear Mr. Magnate, dear Radziwill, please do not kick the Jews out of town. There will be no trade in this town if they go." I mean, it's as bad as that. There is nothing. Travelers who come to Poland say all trade in Poland is in Jewish hands.
And what about craftsmen and things like that?
Craftsmen also developed. That certainly is part of what happens. It's part of this growth in demographic growth. Okay? It's not an expanding economy, like I said. It's exploiting us. The whole economy is more and more. And as the Jewish population grows, there's how are you going to make a living? So more and more Jews actually do turn to crafts to make a living. In fact, this very, very broad Jewish sort of margins developed. Much less compact society in the 1800s, much more Jewish margins and much more kind of odd things happening. So it's a different Jewish world from the 16th century. In addition, the guilds, Christian guilds, were much weaker. The Jews found it much easier to break into those activities.
Just give me a sense of order of magnitude. What was the percentage of Jews living in Poland as contrasted with the Poles?
Okay.
And then what was the percentage of the Jewish population that were these managers, as opposed to
Right.
everybody else?
Okay. From memory, okay? A little under 80% population are peasants.
Eighty.
A little under 80. That's not uncommon. About 10% are noblemen. That's a high percentage. Normally they're less. Around 6% are Jewish, and the rest townspeople and various others. I mean, that's from memory. I haven't got the figures in my hand. What was the other question?
Of the 6%, what percentage of that was the manager versus?
A small percentage. I mean, we're talking about the business elite, we're talking about the richest people. This is a great way to make a living, to make money, and to become rich and powerful. So much, I mean, even to the extent that if you were leasing an estate of this sort, you were an arendage, right? General arendage. You would have the ability to extract yourself from communal discipline. Okay? The Jewish Community Council would make regulations how Jews should behave. Now, if you, as a Jewish estate, at least an arendage, didn't like it, you could go to the magnate and say, excuse me, this Jewish community is making some regulations I don't like, it's going to harm my business. And if it harms my business, it's going to harm your income. Okay? So it created a way even to extract yourself from the Jewish community. So we're not talking about a huge, we're talking about a very small, I don't have numbers. I wouldn't reckon more than a few thousand. And the Jewish population in 1764-5 is about 750,000. And if that helps you.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that, I think you said that 40% of the magnates' income came from their estates.
No, it came from these leases.
Yeah.
Most of their income came from their estates. 40% came from the milling, the taxes, and especially the alcohol sales. That was just me not speaking.
So the other 6, because in a land-based agriculture economy, I couldn't see where else it would come from.
I always say to my students, you don't have to listen to what I'm saying, you have to listen to what I'm thinking.
So you're saying there are a few hundred Jews that are serving the Polish aristocracy.
Right.
And next door there are a few hundred Jews in the Holy Roman Empire, the court Jews, that are serving the aristocracy there.
Yeah.
And down to the south there are Portuguese Jews that are serving, Amsterdam Jews that are serving the Spanish aristocracy.
Right.
It seems like there must be some links among them, because the Jews in Poland had to supply money, had to supply spices and all of this.
Okay.
So what was there in reality?
Right. You're now touching on the topic.
Repeat the question, please.
Okay. He's asking, is there a network of Jewish business elites that covers Europe? Okay? I mean, yes? Sure. Yeah. You're touching on a question that's been at the center of all our discussions this whole year at the center of Advanced Judaic Studies. Every Wednesday. Every Wednesday we have a seminar at 12 o'clock, we gather together and we talk about Jewish networks. Seems to me, anyway. And some people think there are, and some people think there aren't. What do I think? I'm not a great fan of Jewish networks. There are connections. Okay? Jews from Poland go and do trade in the big fair in Leipzig in Germany, and there the court Jews and their agents do trade. Jonathan Israel, who's a scholar, where is he now? Where does he teach now? In Princeton, not far away, has written widely about the existence of Jewish economic networks. In one book, he talked about an Ashkenazic Sephardic network from Eastern Europe to Western Europe to the New World and the colonies, with the court Jews at the center. I have not found any evidence of significant use by the court Jews of the Jewish business the minor Jewish businessmen of Eastern Europe. I haven't seen it documented. It's a great idea. It's really sort of mind expanding to think about it. But in terms of where these poor Jews raised their money, where they raised the fodder and things that they needed for to do what they did in Central Europe, the connections of Eastern Europe are not, to me at least, entirely clear. I'm waiting for someone in one of the seminars to come and prove to me that in the 18th century there is such a network. I'm, at this stage, not a fan of the idea.
You know, I'm having difficulty understanding that if the magnets were directing their economic growth internally, where did all the money come from to go from 17 bars to 40 bars? How did the peasants get this money to buy? Unless the magnets are trading in the outside world, and more money is coming into Poland.
Okay. What? Yeah, okay, I understand. It's not a closed economic system entirely. Okay, there is no such thing as what they call economic as an autarky, totally closed. It doesn't work. There's bound to be connections. So I couldn't, it's difficult enough to say what I said in 45 minutes or however long I spoke. You're absolutely right. There are trading connections. Very nice, very nice. Fits in with what I've been talking about. If I take one more minute, I'll explain to you how it worked. The nobleman grew this grain, and he had to do something with it. Some of it he could sell. He could sell outside the estate, he could sell it. He had to transport it to the ports. Okay? It's not such a profitable business that he can just do that. He needs a business strategy. What's his business strategy? Okay? How does it work? He builds rafts. He gets trees from his estate, he cuts them down, he builds rafts, he puts on the rafts his grain, ships it up the river, tries to sell it. It's not profitable to do. How do you make it profitable? He rented space on his rafts to Jewish merchants, right? Who put their stuff on the rafts and go with it. Okay? And because he had space to rent, that money made his sale a great profitable for him. So once again, we do see this kind of interplay of Jewish businessmen and noblemen to make this system work.
So there was more global merchandising by the Jews outside the country.
There was, yes, there was, certainly. Okay.
Let's
Thank
thank
you very
Adam
much.
Paladin. The field sure has brochures. There are talks that are given under the auspices of the center in various locations, communities, the Lower Merion, in Sacred City, and so on. So please avail yourself of copies of the brochure, and there will be lectures like this by members of the research members of the center. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and